How powerful was the ballista in the Battle of Byzantium? Imagine standing on the city's mighty walls, looking out across the Bosporus, when suddenly great stones and iron bolts scream through the air, smashing towers, tearing through shields and breaking the courage of defenders who once thought their city impregnable. In the civil war between Septimius, Severus, and Pescennius Niger, Byzantium became the stage where Rome's deadliest artillery machine proved its worth. This is great history, where every day we bring you the moments that shape the world. Today, you'll see how one bolt fired from a single ballista swung the balance of a civil war and changed the fate of an emperor. And if stories like this grip you, help us reach 50,000 subscribers, so you can decide which tale we uncover next. The year was 193 a year that would be remembered in Roman history as the year of the 5 emperors. The imperial throne, once the symbol of unshakable authority, became a prize for which powerful men would kill and die. It began with the assassination of Emperor Pertinax, a man whose reign had lasted barely 3 months. His death left a vacuum at the very heart of the empire. Into that chaos stepped rivals, each backed by legions loyal to their own ambitions. Didius Julianus, a wealthy senator, bought the throne from the Taurian Guard, but his rule had no real legitimacy. Across the empire, powerful generals saw their chance. 3 men rose as contenders: Septimius, Severus, governor of Pannonia; Claudius Albinus, governor of Britain; and Pescennius Niger, governor of Syria. In the west, Lucius Septimius Severus, commander of the Danubian legions, moved with decisive speed. His troops were among the most battle-hardened in the empire. Veterans of Rome's northern frontiers, Severus moved quickly. Within weeks, he marched on Rome, swept aside Julianus, and was recognized by the Senate as emperor. But the war was far from over. In the east, Pescennius Niger, the governor of Syria, was hailed as emperor by his troops. Niger was no mere pretender. He commanded the loyalty of Rome's eastern provinces, a region rich in resources and supported by the vital grain supply from Egypt. His power base stretched from the shores of the Levant to the cities of Asia Minor, and his hold on the east promised both wealth and manpower. The road to Byzantium was paved with blood. After seizing the throne in Rome, Septimius Severus marched east to confront his most dangerous rival, Pescennius Niger. Their first great clash came near the city of Cyzicus in Asia Minor. Niger commanded a strong eastern army, legions from Syria and Arabia, seasoned troops from Egypt, and cavalry drawn from the deserts. But Severus, hardened by frontier wars along the Danube, fought with brutal efficiency. At Cyzicus, his disciplined legions broke Niger's lines, and the eastern army scattered in retreat. Niger was not finished. He regrouped further north near Nusha in Bithynia, where the terrain gave him a strong defensive position. There he once again drew up his army to block Severus's advance. The battle was fierce. Shield walls clashed. Cavalry charges thundered. But once more, Severus veterans pressed relentlessly forward. Nika fell and Niger's remaining forces were driven back in disarray. With 2 defeats behind him, Niger's options narrowed. He could not risk another open battle. Instead, he chose to retreat eastward, placing his hopes in the great fortress city of Byzantium. But this retreat set the stage for a different kind of struggle. No longer would victory be decided by swords and open field. It would be fought against stone walls. To understand why the ballista became such a decisive weapon in the siege of Byzantium, we first need to grasp the weight this city carried in Roman strategy. Sitting at the narrow throat of the Bosporus, where the waters of the Black Sea pour into the Sea of Marmara. It was the gateway between Europe and Asia. Whoever controlled Byzantium could choke or release the flow of grain, trade, and armies moving between the provinces. Basically, to control this city was to hold one of the greatest gateways on earth. The maritime bridge between Europe and Asia, and the lifeline linking the grain ports of the Black Sea to the hungry markets of the Mediterranean. When the Roman world fell into civil war, Pescennius Niger understood this better than anyone. He placed the defense of Byzantium in the hands of the proconsul Acilius Aemilianus, a trusted commander who knew the city's strategic worth. With its commanding position, Byzantium could choke any fleet trying to pass from one continent to the other. A lever of power no army on land could ignore. From this stronghold, Niger could wait for the eastern provinces to rally, for Egypt's grain fleets to support him, and perhaps even for Partha to intervene. The city's position allowed him to threaten C's rear and keep alive the hope of reclaiming the initiative. Herodian describes it as a fortress, both rich and formidable. Its wealth came from the sea, tolls collected from every vessel that passed its harbors, and fisheries that fed not only the city, but lined the coffers of its rulers. This prosperity had been poured into defenses. Byzantium's walls, by some accounts, rose over 12 meters high and several meters thick. Built of massive ashlar blocks, so finely cut they seemed a single unbroken mass. Siege ramps or ladders were useless against such a barrier without sustained artillery fire. Perched on a triangular peninsula, it was shielded on three sides by water: the Bosporus to the east, the Golden Horn to the north, and the Propontis to the south. Only the narrow landward side, less than 2 kilometers wide, offered an avenue for attack. This geography turned the city into a natural fortress, an island with a drawbridge where the sea itself was part of the walls. The city's land walls were formidable even before the later Theodosian expansions. Contemporary accounts describe courses of finely cut ashlar stones stacked so tightly that seams were almost invisible. The curtain walls rose to heights estimated at 10 to 12 meters, reinforced with towers at regular intervals. These towers gave defenders a commanding view of the plain, allowing archers, slingers, and artillery crews to pour fire down on any engine that dared approach. But Byzantium's strength was not just in its walls. The surrounding waters served as both moat and highway. A fleet of warships stationed in its harbors could patrol the Bosporus, cut into C's supply convoys, and bring in grain, weapons, and reinforcements from friendly provinces. As long as ships could slip past the blockade, the garrison would never run short of food. This made the city uniquely resilient. Sieges that might have starved out other fortresses in months dragged on for years here. The defenders themselves were seasoned. Niger had garrisoned Byzantium with archers from Syria, infantry from Asia Minor, and experienced sailors who manned the walls facing the sea. Cassius Dio emphasizes, however, that Byzantium itself was extensively fortified. Its walls bristled with engines in the greatest variety: stone throwers, beam hurlers, and hooked grappling devices along the entire length. A heavy harbor chain and flanking towers on Byzantium's breakwaters further made approach by ship very dangerous. Indeed, Dio notes that the Bosporus current was a great advantage to the inhabitants. An enemy ship caught in it would be thrown onto shore. To the Romans assaulting it, Byzantium was a nightmare. The land front was narrow, forcing Seas to concentrate his forces under a rain of missiles. The sea fronts meant that the city could not be completely cut off, and the massive stone walls resisted ram blows and undermining. Gibbon would later call it one of the great portals between continents. This made the ballista essential. The ballista was not just another engine of war. It was the pinnacle of Roman engineering applied to the battlefield. Its design relied on torsion power, a principle that magnified human strength into mechanical violence. Unlike the simple catapult, which bent wood or swung a counterweight to throw a missile, the ballista harnessed skeins of sinew, hair, or rawhide twisted into dense bundles. These skeins acted like enormous springs, storing tremendous energy. When the arms of the machine were winched back, the tension in the twisted fibers grew taut, and when released, they snapped forward with explosive speed. The result was a weapon that could fire iron-headed bolts or stone spheres with lethal precision. Ancient writers often compared the ballista to a giant crossbow, but that analogy undersells its destructive capability. A crossbow killed men. A ballista could kill men and reshape the battlefield itself. Archaeological finds and reconstructions suggest that bolts fired from a medium ballista could reach speeds of over 100 meters per second. Fast enough to pierce shields, armor, and even pin multiple men together in grisly fashion. The psychological effect was no less devastating. Defenders on the walls of a city never knew when a thunderous crack would signal the release of a bolt hurtling straight toward them. In contrast to the onager, the great stone-throwing catapult that hurled massive rocks in wide arcs. The ballista was a weapon of accuracy. Onagers smashed walls through sheer kinetic impact, but their projectiles were erratic, often bouncing unpredictably. The ballista, by comparison, could be aimed with remarkable precision. Crews adjusted elevation and torsion tension with care, targeting not just a wall, but the weak points, the joins between stones, the crenellations that sheltered archers, the wooden hoardings that jutted out from towers. This accuracy meant that ballista were not only siege breakers, but also siege silencers. They suppressed enemy artillery, drove archers from their posts, and carved open safe zones where Roman engineers could advance under cover. By the time of Septimius Severus in the early 3rd century, the ballista had undergone refinements that made it a reliable tool of both field and siege warfare. Vitruvius' writings centuries earlier had already laid down mathematical formulas for building machines according to the weight of the projectile. A 13-kilogram stone required a torsion frame of about 32 centimeters in diameter. A 26-kilogram stone required nearly double that. These ratios ensured optimal power and efficiency. And Roman engineers trained in these specifications produced weapons of standardized reliability. Reconstructions indicate that medium ballista could fire bolts, weighing several pounds across 300 to 400 meters, while heavier lithobloi or stone-throwing variants could launch projectiles of up to 26 kilograms, 57 pounds, with frightening effect. Each machine required a trained crew of 4 to 8 men, one to load, one to aim, others to operate the winches and tensing mechanisms. With drill and discipline, a crew could maintain a rate of 2 to 4 shots per minute. In a siege where dozens of such engines were deployed, this meant a near constant bombardment. Stones battering walls, bolts sweeping parapets, the very air above the battlefield turned into a killing ground. The available accounts give little detail of Roman machines at Byzantium, but imply a massive Roman effort. Cassius Dio famously remarks that Byzantium was besieged for the entire space of 3 years by the armaments of practically the whole world, meaning that enormous Roman resources were committed. Likely, the Romans built the usual siege works: lines of circumvallation to prevent sorties or resupply, siege towers to approach the walls, and artillery to batter defenses. Historians record no decisive Roman assault until the final stages. Instead, he dwells on the defenders' ingenuity. We know, however, from related events that Severus had skilled engineers. For example, the Jewish engineer Priscus, taken captive elsewhere, later built powerful Roman siege engines at Hatra, though not directly attested at Byzantium. Such expertise implies Rome could deploy advanced machinery if needed. The city's walls, rising over 10 meters high and reinforced with projecting towers, were built of cut stone that locked tightly together. Siege towers and ramps could not easily be rolled across the narrow peninsula without first silencing the defenders. Byzantium was also supplied from the sea, so Severus could not simply starve the garrison without first neutralizing their control of the harbor. Here, the ballista became indispensable. First, the ballista silenced the enemy's towers. Heavy bolts as thick as a man's arm were loosed in volleys against the parapets. Each shaft could pierce through wooden mantelets or shatter a shield, forcing archers and slingers back from their positions. With the defenders pinned down, Severus's engineers were free to advance, rolling forward, battering rams, erecting protective mantlets, and raising siege towers. The ballista acted as cover fire, and without it, the work of the engineers would have been suicidal. At ranges of 150 to 250 meters, the crews fired, then shifted position, constantly dodging counterfire from the walls. This rhythm of shoot, move, reload, and fire again turned the plain before the city into a lethal dance between attackers and defenders. Now compare that to the defenses of Byzantium. Before the famous Theodosian walls of the 5th century, the city relied on a much simpler fortification system. Stone curtain walls about 8 to 10 meters high and 2 meters thick at the base. Impressive for the 2nd century, but not invulnerable. A sustained bombardment by ballista striking the same section of wall or a watchtower could loosen stones, weaken mortar, and eventually create a breach wide enough for siege ladders. More critically, the ballista could reach places the ram could not. Caesar's artillery was mounted not only on land, but also aboard warships, giving him angles of fire across the harbor. With incendiary bolts tipped in pitch or oil-soaked rags, he could ignite granaries and storehouses by the waterline, cutting off Byzantium's lifeline. Roman crews concentrated on weak points in the masonry, corners of towers, the upper crenellations, and the joints where blocks met. The stones they hurled often weighed between 5 and 15 kilograms, small enough to fire rapidly, but heavy enough to chip away at the ashlar walls. A rain of impacts could knock Merlin from the parapet, tear down wooden roofing, and expose the defenders above. Against walls built from tightly fitted stone blocks, a single shot did little. But 100 aimed strikes at the same seam could loosen the mortar, crack the clamps, and make even the strongest tower tremble. Byzantium's unique geography made artillery even more vital. 3 sides of the city were protected by the sea, and supplies could still slip through by ship. Severus had to station ballista batteries along the shoreline, not only to harass the walls, but to dominate the waters. From these positions, their fire could smash into supply boats, splinter oars, or even shear through rudders. At close range, a hail of bolts could sweep the decks clear of sailors. The result was a killing zone around the seaward walls, a dead water where no relief fleet could approach without being torn apart. Caesar employed what can only be called a strategy of strangulation. He understood that the walls of Byzantium, massive, though not yet on the scale of the later Theodosian fortifications, could withstand direct assault for months. Instead of rushing headlong, he set about severing every artery that fed the city. The first targets of his siege artillery were not the walls themselves, but the bridges, causeways, and harbor installations that brought food and reinforcements into Byzantium. Every thunderous discharge of the ballista reminded the besieged that even if their walls stood, their lifelines would not. Thus, the siege became a war of attrition, not a race for a breach. Caesar never expected his ballast to shatter the curtain walls in a matter of weeks. Instead, they were instruments of unrelenting pressure. Stone throwers hammered parapets, suppressing defenders on the towers. Heavy bolts swept ramparts clear of missile crews. Incendiary shot ignited storehouses along the waterfront. Meanwhile, engineering teams advanced under the protective cover of mantlets and rams, shielded by ballista fire that silenced defenders above. Every day, the machine struck not to bring instant ruin, but to sap the defenders' endurance, their resources, and their hope. Byzantium's defenders, however, proved resourceful to an extraordinary degree. Cassius Dio's epitome and Herodian's narrative record that the walls bristled with defensive engines, stone throwers, spear casters, and beam launchers that hurled massive timbers onto Roman siege works. Any assault on the gates was met with firepots, stones, and baskets of rubble dropped from towers, often smashing the heads of Severus's rams before they could batter a single blow. The sea was no safer. Byzantium mustered a fleet of some 500 Gs, mostly single-banked but highly maneuverable, some with rudders at both ends. These could charge or retreat without turning, a critical advantage in the swift currents of the Bosporus. Chains stretched across the harbor mouth blocked Roman entry. While the current itself favored defenders, Byzantine sailors used clever strategies. Greek divers swam underwater to sever anchor ropes, setting Roman ships adrift. Others threw grappling hooks with barbed nails, towing enemy ships toward their own harbor. Romans sometimes watched in bewilderment as their vessels seemed to sail of their own accord, only to find them captured by the enemy. Some Byzantines even disguised themselves as merchants, feigned surrender, sold goods at extortionate prices inside the city, then slipped away by sea, once loaded with profit. Yet the siege wore on. The blockade gradually starved Byzantium. With normal supplies exhausted, citizens resorted to desperate improvisations. Timbers from houses were stripped to build makeshift boats. Women's hair was braided into ropes. The bronze statues of public squares were hurled down from the ramparts as giant projectiles. When food ran out, defenders soaked animal hides in brine to extract a few mouthfuls of nourishment. At last, when even these were consumed, Dio records a grim descent into cannibalism. The proud city, famed for its wealth, was reduced to horror. The crisis culminated in a desperate breakout attempt. A flotilla, heavily laden with treasure and grain, sailed out during a storm, hoping to evade the Roman cordon. Instead, Caesar's fleet intercepted them. In the chaos of wind and wave, Roman ships rammed and hooked the defenders' craft, capsizing many, while survivors drowned before the eyes of their comrades on the walls. The next morning, Dio grimly notes, the Bosporus was covered with corpses, wrecks, and blood washing up along the shore. This disaster broke the last vestige of resistance. The city endured astonishingly long. Ancient sources disagree. Dio implies nearly 3 years, while Herodian places the fall around 195 AD, with Severus still campaigning elsewhere during the blockade. In either case, the end was the same. Byzantium, once the portal between continents, collapsed, not through a dramatic breach of its walls, but through slow starvation, naval disaster, and the unrelenting weight of Roman artillery. Caesar's Ballista proved their worth in this grinding siege. They could not topple Byzantium overnight, but they did exactly what they were designed to do: suppress defenders, isolate the city, deny supplies, and apply continuous psychological and physical pressure. Combined with blockade and attrition, they transformed the strongest city in the East into a tomb of hunger. Without the Ballista, the Roman assault on Byzantium in 196 AD would have been an entirely different story. One marked not by calculated dominance, but by protracted frustration. Byzantium's walls were not the fragile palisades of a frontier outpost. They were formidable stone ramparts rising nearly 12 meters, high in places and reinforced by towers that gave defenders an elevated killing ground. Behind them, the city sat on a triangular promontory with the Sea of Marmara to the south and the Golden Horn to the north, making it nearly unapproachable except from the landward side. This meant that every attacking force had to funnel through narrow approaches under withering fire from defenders above. Now imagine stripping away the Roman ballast from this equation. Siege towers would have to inch toward the walls without suppressive fire, exposed to flaming projectiles and stones hurled from catapults on the ramparts. Scaling ladders, the simplest alternative, would turn into mass graves as defenders pushed them back or cut them down. Rams could batter the gates, but only if crews could survive long enough to reach them. And starvation, the classic fallback of a siege, was hardly practical. Byzantium had sea access, which meant supplies could continue to flow in unless the Romans maintained an ironclad naval blockade. In other words, without Ballista, the siege risked dragging on for months, if not years, bleeding Cease army of resources and morale. The Ballista changed this calculus by silencing towers, smashing parapets, and creating openings in the masonry. These machines neutralized Byzantium's strongest card, its walls. They transformed the battle from a hopeless grind into a tactical sequence. Suppress the defenses, protect the engineers, and breach the city. When Byzantium finally capitulated, its punishment was swift and merciless. Cassius Dio records that Septimius CS ordered the execution of all soldiers and magistrates who had resisted, sparing only the ordinary citizens. In one stroke, the city's entire ruling class and professional garrison were wiped out. A deliberate message to the rest of the empire that siding with Pescennius Niger would mean annihilation. Byzantium, once a free polis with proud traditions of autonomy, was formally stripped of its independence. Its territories were confiscated and transferred to the neighboring city of Pinthus, which Dio notes bitterly treated Byzantium like a village. The city that had once commanded tolls on the Bosporus and acted as a maritime crossroads was reduced to provincial obscurity. This severity had immediate political utility. By crushing Niger's last stronghold, Cease secured his hold on the east, freeing him to march westward and confront Claius Albinus. Yet, contemporary observers were troubled by the cost. Dio laments that in razing Byzantium's walls, Severus destroyed not only a rebellious city, but also one of Rome's strongest outposts on the Bosporus, a natural bulwark against tribes from Pontus and Asia Minor. In his view, Cease had sacrificed long-term frontier security for the sake of short-term vengeance. To soften the blow, the emperor allocated funds for rebuilding cities damaged by Niger's forces. Though conspicuously, Byzantium itself was excluded from this program. For decades, the once great port remained a depopulated ruin, and yet the city's story did not end there. Though crushed and stripped of its independence, Byzantium was not erased. Later traditions tell us that Septimius Cease himself, perhaps recognizing its enduring value, refounded the city under the name Augusta Antonina in honor of his son Caracalla. Slowly, painfully, it began to rise again. By the early 3rd century, trade once more flowed through its harbors, and its walls, though scarred, stood tall again. And then, in 330 AD, came the moment that changed the course of history. Constantine the Great transformed Byzantium into Constantinople, the new Rome, jewel of the Bosporus, and the eternal capital of the Eastern Empire. So the siege of 196 AD stands as more than just another Roman victory. It was both a low point and a turning point. Byzantium was humbled, yes, but it was also marked out by fate as a city too important, too strategically placed to ever fade away. And at the heart of that siege was Rome's deadliest machine, the ballista. Against walls that had endured for centuries, against defenders who believed stone and courage alone could shield them, the ballista proved otherwise. It was not brute force alone, but the marriage of engineering, mathematics, and relentless Roman determination that made the difference. Without it, the siege might have dragged on endlessly, bleeding Rome's strength. With it, Byzantium bowed. So, how powerful was the ballista at Byzantium? Thanks for staying with me till the very end. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story from history.